I know what, I'll use that slug character. That could be fun. Alright, so I'm going to open up Maya. So the question Christian from the other group had an issue with, or was kind of puzzled with, was this idea of, well, basically what you can do in Maya is you can create a curve, which we've all done now. And you can use this curve as a motion path. So if I were to just create just a primitive object, like maybe a pipe. So basically what I can do is I can select my object, select my path, and I can do what's called a motion path. So it's under the animation menu set, under the animate menu, and it's down near the bottom here, motion paths. So what I can do is I can just attach that to the motion path. And what it'll do is it'll go from my start of the motion path, and just over whatever my time frame is, or my sequence, it'll just animate along that. I can modify my motion path. I can change the angles of this. And it's just going to kind of go through and animate over that. But this is where there's some issues that might happen. When we get into kind of weird angles, although it's not maybe doing it at the moment, let me just do something a little bit of a longer time frame, like 100 or something like that. And let me just do this again. So I'll just duplicate that. Alright. So again, and maybe I'll have it like pointing forward. So let me just freeze trans. Alright, let me do this one. So I got this guy, I got my motion path. And again, just going to motion paths, I'll tear that off. So the problem happens though sometimes when we're creating our curves. Now it's not going to happen at the moment because of the way I created my curve, but basically the object could flip. It could flip around as it's moving over the surface. But before I get to that, basically what was going to be done with this, which is kind of cool, is that you can actually project your object along the curve, and it's useful for modeling as well, so it's probably good to know. Once it's on the path, we could use this option. It's still under the animate menu, called create animation snapshot. And what this will do, if I go to the option box, is it'll basically project your object along that curve. And again, if you want to do, say, wire casings or something like that, and you need a whole bunch of these things along, maybe this path could be extruded like wires or something through that, so you need these couplings holding everything together. I don't know, you could do a bunch of things with that. But basically, you could have this thing kind of animated, positioned along this curve as a snapshot. You can duplicate that out, and that could be part of your model, essentially. Now, if you want it more evenly spaced, I'll just mention this as a side note. If I undo this, it really depends on the motion path itself. You guys are familiar with the graph editor by now. If you select the actual motion path and go into the graph editor, so animation editor's graph editor. Oh wait, is it the motion path? Where is it? Actually the object, sorry. And I go into there. Where is my motion path? I know it's on here somewhere. Sometimes you actually have to click on it in the channel box to actually access it. So if I click on that, there's the motion path here. And then it'll appear over here in our graph editor. So basically, this is what's causing, if you notice, when I did the snapshot, there's a bunch up at the front and end of the curve. So if we want more evenly spaced objects along the curve, we can just make that linear. So when I do a snapshot again, so let me do that. So animate, create animation snapshot. If it will let me, create animation snapshot. There we go. It'll just give me a more evenly spaced division along the curve. And you can throw one right now, each one represents one frame. But you can do one every 2 frames if you want more spacing, or every 4 frames, 5 frames, or half a frame. And it'll just kind of either tighten it up or spread them apart between the start and end of the curve. Now, the problem, though, was if I were to open up his file, which you can take a look at, it's under Resources, Chris, Semester 1 Student Help. So you guys can put stuff in here, too, if you need a hand with anything. The problem was this. When you get into these custom-made curves, you have to be very specific with how they're created. Otherwise, what happens when your object's moving over the curve, and what I'm going to do is just make it bigger so we can see it a little bit more clearly. As it's going over the curve, when we get into some of these areas here, it'll actually flip over on itself. Because what happens is with a curve, there really aren't normals. There's no real direction with the curve, right? It's just a randomized thing. It's just an object that exists in U. There's no V. There's no real surface to that. So there's no surface normals. So it doesn't really know what direction it should be pointing, and it gets confused and starts flipping over on itself. So there's one cool thing that NURBS can do. I'm not a big NURBS fan, but you can use NURBS for this. If I were to go and create a NURBS object, like a plane, for example, maybe increase the patches a bit. One cool thing you can do is you can actually create what's called a surface curve. And to do that, you just select your NURBS and use this icon, which is the Make Live. What Make Live will do is it'll basically snap any object to the surface of that. But the cool thing is if I use my curve tools here and just draw a curve over this, this curve will be locked to that surface. So if I turn off the magnet tool here, so this curve is actually locked to that surface. So if I were to actually go in and move my surface, oh, I got it. Let me just go back in and change this back to this default, which is there. If I were to move this, you can see that the curve will actually stay locked to that surface, which means that if I were to, flip this around like the roller coaster or move this around, everything stays together. Now the cool thing, though, is that you can actually use the normals on the surface to tell the curve what direction it should be pointing in. So if I were to actually attach a surface to this as a motion path, so let me just create something. Create polygons. I'll use a pipe again. And let me just rotate it on its side just a bit. All right. And let me do one more thing, free strands. All right, so what I can do is I can attach this to that motion path. Using, again, attach to motion path. And the cool thing, though, is that, whoops, I gotta do one more thing. I'm gonna do, go into the option box. I just want to make sure world type is set to normal. And what that's going to do is it's going to use the normal direction of the surface to tell it what direction it should be pointing in. And then I should also decide, well, what's facing forward? So actually I want this to, the open side facing forward. So in that case it's going to be negative Z. So I just got to inverse the Z value. I'm going to apply it again. So this way it's going to be perfectly aligned to the surface. And it's not going to randomly flip over on itself at all, and no matter how curved or angled that is. So I could go in, if I maybe shrink this down, I can do a snapshot of that. So let me do that. So animate. Might take a second. Any second now. Too many. There's too many of them. Let me do one more snapshot, but this time I'm going to do one option here. So animated snapshot, option box, and I'll do maybe every 20 frames. All right. So again, it's going to give me a perfect transition over the entire surface. Now again, this has ease in, ease out on, so it's going to bunch up the start and end. Now the problem though with this roller coaster is that the curve's already been done, so how do you fix that? Well, what you need to do is just generate a surface using the Extrude tool that we looked at under the surface creation. So if we look at what I did over here, is that using the original curve, I just took a profile curve, similar to what we did the other day when we were using, revolves and lofts and all that stuff. And I just ran that over and created a NURBS, a patch basically. And then with that patch, which I just moved by accident, with that patch, we can then create a surface curve from that, just by doing this. Selecting a curve, and then going under the surfaces. Where are you here? Just there we go. Under edit curves, offset, and we can just offset a surface curve just with a 0% distance, so that basically it'll be offset right from where we created it, which I can then use as a motion path. So when this is moving over top of the surface, so when this is actually moving over the surface, it's going to adhere exactly to how I've laid out the surface, basically. So it's not going to flip and do anything kind of weird and all that. All right, well that's that. So that was a question. It's a unique question. It's a tricky one too. I mean, it's easy to do once you know how to do it. But I had to dig back 15 years ago when we're still using NURBS, or not 15 years, but 10 years ago, whatever. In my mind. But anywho, so that's that. All right, so let me stop that.